The sheriff's cruiser lights flashed across my property as deputies escorted Margaret Henderson and her husband off my land. She screamed with a shrill voice about her community rights while waving a crumpled HOA pamphlet in the air. Her face had turned the color of a ripe tomato as she stomped past the private property sign I had nailed to the old oak tree by the lake just days before. I stood there holding my deed, watching justice finally play out after weeks of harassment. It all started 2 months ago when I inherited Grandpa Joe's ranch, 40 acres of pristine Texas countryside with a beautiful private lake right in the middle. After years of city living, I was desperate for some peace and quiet. That first Friday evening, I packed my truck with camping gear and headed out to my new property. The drive from Houston took 3 hours, but when I saw that crystal clear water reflecting the sunset, every mile was worth it. I set up my tent near the shoreline, built a proper campfire in the stone ring Grandpa had made years ago, and settled in with some marshmallows and a cold drink. The crickets were singing, fish were jumping, and for the first time in months I felt my shoulders relax. That lasted exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes. A golf cart came bouncing down my private road, headlights cutting through the darkness. Out stepped Margaret Henderson, clipboard in hand, wearing what I can only describe as suburban battle armor, pressed khakis, a polo shirt with Willowbrook HOA embroidered on it, and a visor. Despite it being 9 at night, she marched up to my campfire and announced in a nasal voice that I was trespassing on community property. According to her, this lake was part of the Willowbrook recreational zone, and I needed to pack up immediately. I explained calmly that this was my ranch, inherited from my grandfather, and showed her the property markers. She squinted at them with obvious disdain and informed me that the HOA had annexed this area for resident use. The next morning, I woke to find her back with reinforcements. 3 other board members stood beside her, all wearing matching polos like some kind of suburban militia. They insisted I was wrong about my property lines and threatened to call the authorities if I didn't leave within the hour. I pulled out my phone and showed them the digital copy of my deed, the survey maps, even the tax records showing I'd paid property taxes for this land. Margaret's voice grew louder and more aggressive as she declared that their community bylaws superseded any documents I might have when I refused to budge. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, reporting a suspicious squatter who was threatening HOA board members. I couldn't help but laugh, which only made her angrier. 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. Margaret rushed over to them, gesturing wildly at me and my campsite. The officers listened patiently, then walked over to where I sat by the dying embers of my fire. I handed them my documentation without saying a word. Deputy Martinez studied the papers carefully while Deputy Chen pulled up property records on his tablet. After 10 minutes of verification, Deputy Martinez walked back to Margaret with a stern expression. He explained in a firm tone that I was the legal owner of this property and had every right to camp on my own land. He warned her about making false reports and suggested she review the actual HOA boundaries before making any more claims. Her face went from red to purple as she sputtered about community standards and proper procedures. The deputies left with apologies for the disturbance, and I thought that would be the end of it. How wrong I was. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 17 emails from Margaret demanding I attend HOA meetings about my supposed violations. She claimed my camping was lowering property values and creating an eyesore visible from the Willowbrook walking trail, which was supposedly nearby, though I'd never seen it. Then came the Saturday that changed everything. I arrived at the ranch to find absolute chaos. Margaret, her husband Harold, their 2 adult children, and about 15 other people had set up an entire camping village on my property. Tents everywhere, cars parked on my grass, and worst of all, 3 paddle boats tied to my private dock. A banner reading Willowbrook Community Lake Day hung between 2 trees. Margaret spotted me and walked over with a smug smile, informing me that the HOA had voted to reclaim this space for community use. She handed me a photocopy of meeting minutes where they'd apparently decided my lake was abandoned property and therefore available for resident enjoyment. The vote was unanimous among the 5 board members present, all of whom were currently roasting hot dogs on my shoreline. I took photos of everything Every tent, every car, every person trespassing on my land. My trail cameras had captured them arriving at dawn, cutting my chain and removing my no trespassing signs. Margaret had even brought a laminating machine to make official-looking HOA-like access permits. She was handing out to arriving neighbors instead of confronting them directly. I drove back to town and went straight to the sheriff's office. I filed formal trespassing complaints against every person I could identify with Margaret Henderson at the top of the list. The desk sergeant looked at my evidence and shook his head in disbelief. He dealt with HOA overreach before, but this was a new level of audacity. By the time I returned with 4 deputies and official eviction notices, the party was in full swing. Someone had brought a portable speaker blasting music across my peaceful ranch. Kids were swimming in my lake while their parents lounged in lawn chairs drinking beer. Margaret had set up a registration table where she was signing people in for their allotted lake time. Deputy Martinez used his vehicle's PA system to announce that everyone was trespassing on private property and needed to leave immediately. The music stopped, conversations died, and all eyes turned to the 4 patrol cars now blocking the access road. Margaret stormed over, waving her HOA rule book, claiming they had every right to be there under Section 12.4 of their community guidelines. The deputy handed her the eviction notice and explained she had 30 minutes to pack up and leave or face arrest. She tried arguing about easements and community access rights, but Deputy Chen cut her off. He pointed out that the Willowbrook subdivision was actually 3 miles away and had zero legal claim to this property. Their own HOA maps, which he pulled up on his tablet, clearly showed their boundaries ending at Farm Road 427. Margaret's confident facade began to crack as neighbors started packing up their gear. Some apologized to me directly, saying they'd only come because Margaret insisted it was approved. Others slunk away to their cars, avoiding eye contact, but Margaret stood her ground, insisting this was theft of community resources and she would be contacting her lawyer when the 30 minutes expired. Only Margaret and Harold remained. She'd sent her children away but refused to move herself. Deputy Martinez placed her under arrest for criminal trespassing as she screamed about discrimination and abuse of power. Harold followed, voluntarily muttering apologies that his wife couldn't hear over her own shouting as they drove away in separate patrol cars. I noticed several neighbors filming the scene on their phones. The story exploded on the Willowbrook Facebook page within hours. Turns out Margaret had been making everyone's life miserable for years with arbitrary fines and mad-up violations. People started sharing their own stories of her power trips and unauthorized rule changes. Then came the bombshell that changed everything. A former board member named Janet posted the real HOA meeting minutes. Margaret had been voted off the board 6 months earlier for misusing funds, but she'd refused to accept it and kept acting as president. The actual board had been trying to serve her with a cease and desist letter, but she'd been dodging them. My incident gave them the perfect opportunity to finally expose her fraud. Monday morning, I met with a district attorney who was very interested in pressing charges between the criminal trespassing, the false 911 call, and impersonating an HOA official. Margaret was facing serious consequences. The D mentioned potential charges of fraud and organized theft for collecting HOA dues she wasn't authorized to receive at her arraignment. Margaret stood before Judge Wheeler, still insisting she had authority over my lake. The judge reviewed the evidence and set bail at $25,000. She was charged with criminal trespassing, filing a false police report, fraud, and impersonating a corporate officer. Each charge carried potential jail time and hefty fines. The trial took 3 months to schedule, during which Margaret violated her bail conditions twice by sending me threatening emails about community standards. Each violation added to her charges. When the verdict finally came, she was found guilty on all counts. Judge Wheeler sentenced her to 18 months in prison, suspended to probation, plus $45,000 in fines and restitution. She was also ordered to stay 500 feet away from my property and banned from serving on any HOA board in Texas for 10 years. Margaret's scream of "This is not over" echoed through the courtroom as the bailiff escorted her out, her designer handbag clutched to her chest and tears of rage streaming down her case.